We're going to reference your book a little bit here. All right, so ICS fundamentals. So as we go through and we look a little bit at the 4 independent study courses you did, you went through kind of ICS for what we call single resource, those beginning incidents. So you did a little bit of that in your ICS 100 course. There was a little bit of framework on the National Incident Management System, or NIMS, the National Response Framework, and some of that. So kind of the theoretical base that we use to do incident command. So what we're going to do in this unit is we're going to go through, and I just want to talk a little bit about some of the ICS concepts, remind you of some things, and again, we're going to hit on that terminology, and that's so important because I think that gets a lot of us. And looking over your pre-tests and things, I think that was just definitely part of it, which is fine. There's no problem with that. But we're going to kind of get you spun up here. So we've got some objectives. They are in your book. So again, remember those objectives do correspond with our final. Two different screens of those. So if you would, just please review those, and we're going to get into it. So let's first start talking about the incident action planning process. This is what we call the planning P. And if you go in your student manuals to page SM39, student manual page 39, you can see this graphic a little bit easier. This might be a little bit harder to see. Also up here, we've got the planning P underneath this screen, this graph. This has got some extra information on it that may help you as you look at this. But I want to look at this planning P real quick. So does anybody know what the purpose of the planning P is? We call it the operational planning cycle, or the incident action planning process. But I'm going to call it the planning P in this class. So what does the planning P tell us?
Helps for changing the event, maybe keep things.
So as the event changes, so it allows us to plan for changes? Absolutely. What else? Any other thoughts? So when we talk about the planning P, this is the process that we use to go through our incident action plan cycle. So when we put together an IAP, or an incident action plan, we're going to follow this process. So we're going to talk through this quite a bit through the bulk of the class, but I want to talk a little bit about what this process is. So the first thing that we talk about here is what we call the leg of the P. If you see this in your book or up on the screen here. So the leg of the P is something that happens in the initial response, the initial incident. So we have the incident event. So whatever happens kicks off. There's notification. There's typically an initial response. So let's take an example of a brush fire. Okay? So in the leg of the P, our initial response, where does the initial response come from? Yep, so your local fire department goes out per their protocol. So the fire department goes out there and they see, whatever they see, a 50 by 50 brush fire. And we've got a nice day like today, the fire danger's high, the winds are whipping, and they're going, we probably need more resources, right? That pretty typical for fire departments. So maybe we'll pick on Nikiski, so maybe you call Kenai, and forestry comes out as well. So you get a couple departments on your scene, the fire's growing. Right? So at some point in there, the incident commander for the fire department at that scene is going to determine that additional resources are needed, or it's going to grow into something that's bigger. So let's take this example here. So who is the incident commander that's going to make that decision? Does anybody know?
The initial person on scene. I mean, it could be me, it could be the chief.
Yeah, whoever's in charge for that responding agency, the agency that has jurisdiction. We're going to ignore forestry for a second just in this scenario. So captain out there says, this is going to get bad. We need more resources. This is going to become a thing, right? So then we start going up the leg of the P. So we've had our initial response. Our firefighters are out there. They're doing the thing they do. They contain. They're doing all of those types of things. And then we get into what's called here, this says incident brief, the ICS 201. The ICS 201 is a form. We haven't looked at it yet. You may have seen it a little bit in the independent study classes, but that's basically an incident briefing. And the purpose of that incident briefing form is to hand off to the incident management team kind of a summary of what's happening. You'll see this is a wildfire, so it'll talk about the size up, how big it is, what it's threatening, a map. It'll have some of that basic information in it. So as we start going up here, we're going to get an initial unified command or incident command meeting. So we haven't talked too much about unified command yet, but can somebody define unified command for me?
Multi-jurisdictional overlapping commands, so you've got a single consolidated view.
Okay, so something that could be in multiple jurisdictions, absolutely. So that's a very, very common example of unified command. So let's say in our scenario that our fire started out in Nikiski, but it's rapidly coming towards Kenai. And so Kenai is its own jurisdiction, so they would have a command authority in it. Can you think of any other examples that might be unified command? I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but where else? So we've got multi-jurisdictional, but there's one other big one.
Fires threatening industry of some sort, a refinery or something like that.
Yep.
They're obviously going to be involved.
Absolutely. And it's common here in Alaska. I'll take a little sidebar here for a second. So we're going to bring forestry back into the fold. So there's a couple types of incidents that are very specific in Alaska that get managed. One of them is wildland fire. That is the Department of Forestry's responsibility. So forestry puts out the fire. But that's all basically that forestry does. So as you've seen in some of these unified commands that we've had here in the past couple of years, what if that fire is threatening industry, is threatening residents? So now whose responsibility is that if it's in Nikiski? What do you think? Who evacuates people and does mass care?
Borough OEM.
Borough OEM. So it's very, very common. So we might have a unified command that has a forestry incident commander, the borough incident commander, maybe City of Kenai incident commander if it's starting to be multi-jurisdictional. So it can be multi-jurisdictional or it can be multi-agency, depending on laws and your responsibilities. So we're going to get into unified command a lot more here, but let's leave it at that for now. So we have an initial unified command meeting. So let's say the forestry incident commander and the borough incident commander and the City of Kenai incident commander meet, and we have that initial meeting to form our incident management team. So that's coming up. That's our initial response. So now as our team takes over, we start in the P, and we start here and we go around the circle, and this becomes kind of a continuous process. So the next thing in here is the incident command or unified command, and I'm just going to say unified command in this scenario. Develop and update the objectives. This is a meeting. So one of the principles of ICS is we manage by what? Objective. Absolutely. So that's a core tenet of how we do this. So what we're going to do as unified commanders, we're going to get together and have a unified set of objectives to give our incident management team. So can somebody give me an example of an objective? Yes. Put out the fire. Why aren't you doing that now? Let's put out the fire. Okay? What are some other objectives that we might have in this scenario? Protect our structures, protect our values at risk, however we phrase that. Yep. How about
Environmental conservation.
Yep. People, so probably an objective in there about keeping people safe, maybe evacuating people. There's probably going to be an objective in there about keeping the people informed because this is modern day, and so we have to have our public information part of that, right? So we're going to develop the objectives. Then we go to our command and general staff meeting. So again, refresher, who's our command and general staff?
Command is the public information safety liaison, and then the general is the operations planning and logistics planning.
Yep. So when we say command and general staff meeting, this is going to be the top of this. So this is going to be this group here and these section chiefs up here of the FLOP. Remember the FLOP? Finance, logistics, operations planning. Yep. So as we start down this, you see here we started with this objectives meeting, then we're getting into this meeting with the command and general staff. Then we go to preparing for the tactics meeting. And then we get into a tactics meeting. So are you seeing the pattern here? There's an awful lot of meetings. When we get into our units that come after this, we're going to get into detail about what all of these meetings are. So we're not going to get into the weeds right now. Some of these meetings, although this looks like it's a very big thing, and again, remember how I said, boy, this is a bureaucracy. What is it you do? You have org charts and you have meetings, right? Some of these meetings are very, very informal. Some of these meetings are 5 minutes long. Sometimes it's just enough that some of us need to get in a room, have some consensus, and then we're done and we move on to the next thing. So we'll get into detail on that. So then we're at this corner, we have the tactics meeting. So once we have our tactics, who can tell me a tactic? What do I mean by a tactic? Can you give me an example in this scenario? So a tactic is how we are going to accomplish a strategy. And we didn't talk about strategy here, but let's just say the tactics are going to be, we're going to send in 5 Type 6 brush engines, and we're going to create a perimeter and try and contain the fire. Right? That's a tactic. So we've decided on what tactics we're going to use for the next operational period. And that's something I didn't talk about in here, is that when we're going through the planning P, we are doing the plan for the next operational period. And your operational period, we talked about a little bit, is defined by incident. So that could be, you know, starting in a few hours if this is the initial planning P, or this could be for the next day, or perhaps the next shift. So we're in a wildfire scenario, so very common up here to do 12-hour operational periods. So what will happen is during the day, the team that's here on staff during the day is actually planning operations for night shift for the next day, and so on. So as we follow the P, we then get into preparing for the planning meeting. So this is, again, we'll get into that, a lot of preparing some of the forms and safety analysis, some of this, and then we get into the planning meeting. Planning meeting is a much bigger meeting, a little bit more formal. Once we agree on the plan, we go through and go into the next part of the P, which is IAP preparation and approval. So this is where the plan is being assembled and put together, that formal plan. And then we have the operations briefing. That's when our tactical supervisors, so when we start talking about some of the people in the operations section, we haven't gone through here too much, but our division and group supervisors start to be on in this, and this is where it's a briefing for what's going to happen. So we're going to take the plan, and then we're going to brief on it. Once that new operations period begins, we execute the plan that we did, we assess its progress, its usefulness, and then the thing about the circle is we come back now to this. So now we're looking at our objectives again. Can objectives change from operational period to operational period? Yeah, absolutely. Things change. What did we talk about earlier? It's a nice day and the wind shifted. The weather changed, you name it. It got more complex, it got less complex. So we're going to be, this is going to be key for what we're going to be doing. We're going to be on the planning P. So we're going to get into each piece of the P over the next day or two. But this is what we mean by the process, or the planning P for short. Does that make sense? Sort of? It's a tool to help. It looks a lot more complex than it is. So once we start breaking this down, I think this is going to make a lot more sense for you. So planning P, so real critical to start with that. So again, that is on page 39 of your book, if you want to reference that as we go forward. Questions on the planning P? All right. So one of your independent study classes was the National Incident Management System. Anybody kind of talk to me about what NIMS is, just very broadly?
It's the overall kind of the set standard of how they're going to do it.
Yeah, exactly. It's our framework. So the National Incident Management System has a couple different components to it. So it has resource management, communications and information management, and then it has command and coordination. Command and coordination is where the incident command system sits. So ICS is part of this bigger NIMS framework. And you can go on and you can download the NIMS book. It's interesting to a point, but it has a lot of information on there if you're looking for kind of a specific answer. But under command and coordination, there's a couple different programs in here. We're focusing on ICS. There's how we organize an emergency operations center, multi-agency coordination groups, or MAC groups, that you're going to hear that term a little bit in this class. MAC groups are more the next class, ICS 400. Joint information systems, which is kind of more around the PIO section. Real quick, just because this is often confused, does anybody know the difference? Let me back up. What's an emergency operations center? Does anybody know what an EOC is?
One big room with a whole bunch of computers and a whole bunch of people that are representing different agencies, different jurisdictions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's pretty much what it physically describes. And yes, it's usually a whole bunch of computers, a whole bunch of people, sort of managed chaos sometimes. What do we do in there? What do we do in an EOC?
All the things.
Okay, be more specific. We do all the things, but what specifically is an EOC defined as, because there's actually a specific function that an EOC does. So I'm curious if anybody knows that off the top of your head.
Central maintenance of situational awareness?
Yes, in a sense. So an EOC is actually, by the definition that we use in ICS, an emergency operations center is a supporting facility for the incident. So typically when you go to bigger cities, so there's a lot of, we kind of have a hybrid model, but if you go to a jurisdiction that runs EOCs specifically, or they focus on that, a lot of what you're going to see in there is that supportive work. Situational awareness is a big one, but the other big one is resource ordering. So a lot of times the EOC is designed to support what's going on in the field, and the field command is referred to as an ICP, an incident command post. So the key difference technically is we don't command an incident out of an emergency operations center by definition. Now that I've said that, here at the borough we kind of do both. So we kind of have a hybrid where we've organized incidents where we actually have a field incident command post. So a perfect example of this is flooding in Seward. We typically send a crew of people that do the actual in the field stuff over, and we establish an incident command post while running an EOC here to do ordering and support and logistics. But sometimes we do everything out of the EOC or out of our OEM buildings. So the book definition of an EOC is it's a supporting agency. And the reason why I point that out is if you look on the screen, that Emergency Operations Center, under some of the newer NIMS guidance that came out a couple years ago, there's a center management. There's a different way to organize EOCs. It's beyond the scope of this class, but I just thought I'd mention it. So take home for this, the incident command system is part of NIMS. Some management characteristics of NIMS. Take a look at that screen for a minute. There's 14 components of NIMS. So when we talk about the characteristics, I want to go through a couple with you. So let's start up the top. Just the highlights of these. So common terminology. Yeah, ICS has common terminology, right? So not yet, not common yet, let's put it that way. But we have things that are standardized. So when I talk about an ICP, an incident command post, by the end of this class, you're going to know that that's in the field, that's where we command things from, and the EOC is something a little bit different, right? Management by objectives. Again, we just talked a little bit about that. Incident command or unified command is going to set objectives for us to meet. Put out the fire, evacuate the people. And we're going to do SMART objectives, which is in the next unit. So we'll get to that. We're going to have a manageable span of control. Does somebody know what span of control, what do you do? What's that definition? What is a span of control?
Go for your duties.
I'm sorry?
Go for your duties.
No, not quite. So span of control.
Management of your people, like 5 to 7. You should only manage 5 to 7.
Okay. So yes, so span of control is how many people are underneath you. How many people is the logistics section chief managing? So when we talk about a manageable span of control, you talked about 5 to 7. Is that the number that you should do?
That's what they used to recommend.
Yeah.
5 to 7 is what you should do, and then have another leader.
Correct. So it used to be, so I'm going to talk about the used to be and then what it says now. So the old curriculum, the old NIMS, before they revised it, said that generally a supervisor should have 3 to 7 people, ideally 5, and that is the maximum amount of people that you can supervise effectively in an incident. So I always used to make the joke that if anybody here had more than 7 people reporting to them, you better get more people in your budget, right? Now they talk about being a little bit more manageable, where depending on the situation, you may have more than that number reporting to you. And like the fire service is a good example, where you may have quite a few crews that you can manage, more than that. Law enforcement was another example, and I think law enforcement is where it was actually kind of that change pushed from. But a manageable span of control. So essentially what that means is don't manage more than you can effectively do. And remember, incident management is high stress, a lot going on, so you might have 10 direct reports in your regular job. That might not be the best idea in an incident. So, manageable span of control. Resource management. We'll talk about that. People, things. Establishment and transfer of command. Transfer of command. What do we mean by that?
Someone gets relieved?
Yep. Yeah. A new command comes in for whatever reason. We have to transfer that command. We've got to do that deliberately. So yep, somebody gets relieved for whatever reason, gets switched out. Chain of command. We've got some military folks in here. Does everybody know chain of command? So we have a very specific order above us of where we go, who we supervise. What's unity of command? Anybody know that term? Did you pick that up on your...
I get unity and the unified protocol.
Yep, and we're going to talk about that actually. That's coming up. But
Good, that's on my list.
unity of command. So unity of command is basically a very fancy way of saying you have one supervisor that directs you. Who would like that to be in their real job, where you only have one person telling you what to do, right? So the logistics section chief works for the incident commander. That's unity of command. Only the incident commander tells this person what to do. That is essentially unity of command. Now, that doesn't mean, we're going to get into communications and formal and informal here, that doesn't mean that, you know, the planning section chief can't talk to the logistics section chief. They do all the time, and they should. But when it comes to giving direction, the incident commander tells the logistics section chief. The group supervisor is the one that tells the folks in those groups what their direction is, what their orders are. So essentially, unity of command means one supervisor. Dispatch and deployment, how we do dispatch and deployment. So once you get done with this class, and I know most of you will go to a position-specific class, like the planning section class I'm going to teach. So trust me, this was just a thing. I now know who's going to take that class by your Post-it notes. So when we get done teaching that class and you have your planning section certificate, now once there's an incident, you can just report and start plugging into that incident. Is that right? No, why not? I had some heads shook. Why not? You have to be ordered. So when we talk about dispatch and deployment, just because I happen to have some pieces of paper and do this here, does not mean I can go up to Anchorage and decide I'm in charge today because I can be an incident commander. I have to be ordered, and I have to be ordered for a specific task. So that's what we talk about dispatch and deployment. Modular organization. Someone talk to me about that. What's a modular organization mean when it talks about ICS? Adjust to our needs.
Scalability, just because something's listed on that org chart doesn't necessarily mean
Okay. So if we come here to the finance admin section, Nolan, I see you're running this, so I need you to do all of the things here, right? So we don't necessarily, maybe we don't need a compensation claims unit. If we don't need it, we don't fill it. This box is gone. Maybe we don't need a cost unit. Now, under ICS, Nolan still has to do all of these things because he's the chief. We'll talk about that. But, you know, if we don't have aircraft, we don't have a ground support unit. So does that make sense? So this chart here shows a lot of the things, but it doesn't mean we staff all of those things. In fact, very rarely do we staff a majority of these, at least here at this level. And as incidents get more complex, more of that tends to be staffed. Incident action planning, that's our planning P, right? We follow that process. Incident facilities and locations, I kind of already talked about this. We know what an ICP is. We're going to talk about camps and bases and those definitions, but again, that kind of goes back a little bit to common terminology. Integrated communications, so we have a communications plan. We know how we can talk to each other. All the right people can talk to other folks. Unified command, which we talked about. Accountability, what do we mean by accountability? So just so you know, all of you that maybe become supervisors, if you lose people under your command, that's bad. Don't do that. So accountability talks about safety. We know where our folks are. We have a good system of keeping track of them. Information intelligence management, we're going to talk a little bit about in Unit 5. That's not something we do too much here, but I want to talk about it and talk about that concept a little bit. So unity of command. Jana, we just talked about this. This is your slide. So under unity of command, we only respond to one or report to one supervisor, and we receive work assignments only from that person. So, it is your slide.
Thank you.
So, if I'm Derek and I'm here in the situation unit, now let's just say Derek's in the situation unit. I'm going to work this example. And I'm up here as incident commander. So do I tell Derek what to do? No. Why not? I'm responsible for everything. We talked about this last unit, right? Who tells Derek what to do? Planning. Who in planning?
Planning section chief.
Planning section chief, right. Yep. Now, what if there's no planning section chief? Then yes. Yep. So if any of these boxes are not filled, that doesn't necessarily mean they don't have to get done, but they go up to the next level of responsibility. So if I don't have a documentation unit and I'm the planning section chief, I am responsible for documentation. If I don't fill a section chief, I'm responsible for that entire section. So that happens in smaller incidents for sure, but definitely as you get bigger and spun up, that's not a particularly good idea at those high levels. All right, unity of command and unified command. So Jonna, let's talk about this a little bit. What's the difference? Tell me what unified command is. Let's define that again. We talked about it a few minutes ago.
Multi-agency.
Yep. So it could be a multiple agency with different things. It could be different jurisdictions, like Ben said.
Everybody in the boat rowing together.
There you go. I like it. So unified command is multi-jurisdictional, multi-agency command, where there's not just one incident commander. This isn't one person. This now becomes a group of people up here. Instead of incident command, we call it unified command. Key thing with unified command, we'll talk about this again in a few minutes, is there's generally one spokesperson. So one person is going to be the spokesperson for unified command, and you will see this at meetings where the spokesperson, if that's me, I will talk for these people. There will literally be 2 or 3 people that stand quietly behind me to represent unified command, but there's only one spokesperson. So again, when we talk about unity of command, we don't want 3 or 4 of them talking and maybe saying different things. That's what some of these meetings are for that we'll get into. So, unified command, unity of command is?
Telling you to row.
One person telling you to row. I like that. You're getting your work assignments from one person and you know who that person is. Okay? So if I'm the DMOB unit leader, I know that I report to the planning section chief. I know planning section chief is Brian, but Brian tells me what to do. End of story. So do both those concepts make sense? At least a little bit. We're going to talk a lot more about unified command. I'm sorry? No. You did fine on your tests, by the way. Don't worry about it. So let's get back to chain of command a little bit. We talked a little bit about that. So in the military folks know what chain of command is. This is a very hierarchical structure, just like a lot of the fire services and things are. And this just goes back to what we've talked about. So this visual shows the command staff up there and the general staff. Orderly chain of command is essentially what ICS gives us. Questions on that? So let's talk about communication. So we've been talking a lot about different levels of communication. So when we talk about formal communication, that means that communication follows the chain of command, right? So let's go back to our chart. If I'm the incident commander and I say X, that means I'm going to tell my operations, my planning, my logistics, all these chiefs here in general staff X. And then they're going to tell their unit leaders X. And their reports are going to get told. You see how that means? So that's very formal communication. So if I am the situation unit, what that means is I can pretty much talk to the planning section chief. But if the PIO comes by, I have to be careful not to interact with that person, or else that's going to break the chain of command. Make sense? Shouldn't. Is that true? I can't talk to the PIO because they're not in my chain of command. Is that true?
They're
Okay.
not, but they are.
Not, but they are. Okay. So what if we said the same thing if I'm the documentation unit and the logistics section chief comes by? I talk to them?
Depends on what you're saying, talking. You can say good morning, do you want a cup of coffee?
Okay. All right. Exactly. Yep. So the logistics section chief cannot tell me to go get the coffee. They don't give me orders. Planning section chief gives me orders. But that's the difference. When we talk about formal communication, like assigning work, some of those types of things, that always follows the chain of command. So, receiving and giving work assignments, requesting support, requesting resources, reporting progress, that's all formal communication. That always follows the chain of command. Now, what about informal communication? Exchange incident or event information, or saying good morning, or talking about the game last night, whatever that is. Informal communication is where stuff gets done. I hate to say it, but there is an amazing amount of things that happen via informal communication. So this slide talks about critical information has to flow freely. This isn't meant to be constrained or to constrain communication, but official communications come through the right channel. And I hope Bud is about to tell his PIO coffee story.
I am.
Thank you for that. Go ahead, please.
We talked about that this week. So on Swan Lake Fire and other fire incidents, one of the things we did as the public information officers is we had our own little room. That was where we did our work. And one of the things we did is we had a coffee pot. And we actually brought some decently good coffee in. And we found it was a great tool for having other people come to see us on the incident. We would get people from operations, we get people from the field, we get people from plans, we get people from logistics. Everybody would come because we had coffee. And we actually would even bring in maybe some cookies or something else. So that was a terrific way to draw people in for that informal communication. Because while they were there getting coffee, as a PIO, one of the things we like is pictures. We like videos. We like information of what's going on the line. And so while they were getting their cup of coffee, we'd strike up a conversation how things are going. Hey, do you have any pictures of what you guys are doing? Oh yeah, I got some pictures. We all have iPhones and such, so just a quick airdrop. And now we have intel about what's going on in the field. So there's many different layers of informal communications. As Dan referencing, that is a great way of done. I mean, you guys do this in your departments all the time, right? You see somebody in the hall, hey, what's going on with plans or what's going on with solid waste, if it pertains to your particular department, or maybe it's just background information, or maybe something that'll help you down the road. But lots of things that you do right now internally, you already operate this way. So informal communication is a great way to go.
Yep. So don't hesitate to be talking and to talk during meal times or have the good coffee in your section, whatever that is. If you want the good coffee in your section, who do you order that from, by the way? Well, yeah, Bud.
Is it considered food?
What do you think? Let's go back to the org chart. Who gets you good coffee? Logistics. Yep. You put in a resource order. We'll talk about resource orders.
Put on there good coffee?
Well, we're going to talk about what to put on resource orders, because if you put on good coffee, I might bring you Folgers, because I think Folgers is good coffee, and what you really wanted was Red Goat from Quality Brothers. So, right? Here's some informal communication examples. This slide is just kind of meant to tell you that, the pictures have to be informed. So maybe the cost unit leader needs to talk to the planning section about some costs or burn rate or things that are coming up, but it's not really something formal. They might talk. The food unit, the resource unit is tracking resources, right? Resources that have already been signed on to the incident. Food unit's trying to figure out what's this glut of people that just came in because I know they're here and I need to feed them. So some of these informal communications do happen. So perfectly legitimate. So don't get caught up in the structure. You really can talk to other people that are not in the same box as you, I promise. What do we mean when we say common terminology? This is a thing that's been on a few slides so far. It's part of NIMS. It was one of the 14 NIMS characteristics. In fact, it was the first one they listed. So what do we mean by common terminology? Somebody define common terminology for me.
No 10 codes. 10 codes are common English or...
Okay. So common English, no codes.
What these terminologies.
Local terminology.
Okay. Local terminology, knowing what terminology is up here. What are some other thoughts? Common terminology.
If I ask for one thing, like for local fire departments, if I ask for a tanker, to me that means a truck that has a bunch of water.
Not the airplane version?
Where forestry,
Right.
or if they ask for a tanker, they're talking about an airplane
Right.
with water. And it's a completely different thing.
Yep.
And we've got to make sure we're on the same page, otherwise
Yep. So, which was not what you wanted apparently. That might put out the structure fire, I don't know, with some other damage. So resource description, so that's kind of alluded to on this slide is exactly what's said. So that was the same thing as good coffee, right? What does good coffee mean to you versus good coffee mean to me? Now, in Instant Command, we talk about typing resources, which eliminates some of that, which we'll talk about. What are some other definitions of common terminology? What about this half of the room? Common terminology. What does that mean to you?
I think one of the biggest things with me personally is making sure that if I'm using an acronym that I'm explaining what the acronym is, and vice versa, if somebody uses an acronym to me and I don't understand it, to clarify what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Bud, go ahead and send out a WEA on the EAS. Is that common terminology? Bud, you know what that is?
I do.
Okay. So I just asked Bud to send out a wireless emergency alert via the emergency alert system. Bud and I knew what that meant, so is that okay to say? Not outside our own organization, it's not. So when we're talking to people, and especially when we're coming into this where people are coming from different backgrounds and different agencies, we have to define those terms, those acronyms, things like that. So when we talk about common terminology, that means we're going to use plain language when we're talking to people that are outside of our own organization. It means we're going to use common terms, the standardized terms for incident facilities. So I've kind of alluded to this a couple times. Tell me again what an incident command post is, an ICP. What's the definition of an incident command post?
Location where the instant command takes place.
Okay, so commanding where? Where am I commanding? So I have an incident command post. Where's that probably located? In the field, probably pretty close to the incident, right? We talked about an EOC. An EOC usually does what with the ICP? Supports it. Maybe by logistics, resource orders, it provides supporting function to the incident command post in the field. What's a staging area? What would you think, when I say staging area, what do you think that is?
Somewhere away from the incident, not too far, but somewhere where they can put the trucks and not plug up the incident itself.
Staging place for your resources and equipment.
Okay, yep, so I think both of those are right. It's usually a little bit further away, but it's somewhere close. It's someplace where you stage things. Why would you want to stage things? Is that things that you're waiting to order?
You're ready to go.
Okay, so staging areas where you might stage things and they are ready to go. So essentially they are on your incident already. You've ordered them, you've received them, but you maybe don't have a place for them just yet, an assignment. So operations usually has things in staging that they might imminently need, or maybe we need to do a repair and inspect. You know, there's some reason they're not quite out there yet. So that's a staging area. So what about a base? What do you think a base is?
Spot you operate from.
Okay. What do you do specifically at a base? There's one specific function that usually takes place at a base.
Housing of personnel.
Okay, not housing of personnel.
Air operations, possibly.
Not air operations. You're thinking, think wildland fire-ish.
You ready to respond?
No, that's in staging. If you're in staging, you're at a ready state.
Where you rest?
No, not where you rest. But a base is usually more logistical. So you have a logistics function that typically runs out of a base, like a forward base. So a lot of times you have folks in the logistics function at a base. So what about a camp? What do you do at a camp? Rest. That's where your folks are resting. They're getting meals. They're off shift, that type of thing. So the reason I go through all this, you don't have to memorize all those things quite yet, but it is good to know that terminology is we define incident facilities that way. An ICP, an EOC, a camp, a base, they all have a very specific meaning. Remember at the beginning of this morning when I said terminology was going to be a big thing for folks. So some things to remember. Position titles. Let's talk about that real quick. So we've been kind of harping on this all morning, right? Let's go back to our org chart. You know, it's front and center for a reason. When we talk about position titles, this doesn't have it here, but I've been talking about the operations section chief. Logistics section chief, right? So there's a lot of other positions that aren't on that org chart, but the more you get into things, the more you'll see different titles. Those titles that people have are very, very specific. So here's something that happens all the time. I don't know why this example happens all the time. Okay, Sean, I'm going to need you to be the medical officer. Doesn't exist. For some reason, I hear medical officer all the time, but that's not a position that actually exists in the incident command system. So we use this common terminology, common under our ICS world, to define who these folks are. Ben had a great thing. All these people that come together, they know their role. They know their lane. It's defined. So we've got a little bit of a cheat sheet over here for you that I want, if you can get to turn around just a little bit. If you get confused on the titles of things and who the assistants are, this is a great go-to. This is a slide that's going to come up a little bit later. So when we talk about incident command, the incident commander is the main point, but they may have a deputy. So the second for an incident commander is a deputy. Where when we talk about general staff, that's a chief, operations section chief, planning section chief. If they have somebody, they also have a deputy planning section chief. We haven't talked too much about deputies and things yet, but often they'll take part of the core response and they'll handle one piece of it. So I'll give you an example. For COVID-19, for the borough, I'm the incident commander, but Bud is the deputy incident commander. And Bud has authority over vaccinations. So he handles that piece of the incident. So there's a possible way to do things. Command staff is an officer. So we have a public information officer, a safety officer. And if they have seconds, they have an assistant public information officer. Branch director, again, has a deputy. If it's a division or group, theirs is a supervisor. Unit leaders, resource leaders. So this terminology does get confusing for folks. So I wanted to point that out. This is in the back here for you to reference throughout the next couple days. It does get a little bit confusing as we start talking about different position titles. So does that make sense a little bit? This chart doesn't have it, but we'll start talking in some of that context. Incident management roles. So let's take a 6-minute break. It's 6 minutes to the hour. Let's come back at 11 a.m. Let's get up and stretch our legs here real quick.